Hey guys, this is Kyle. We're going to do things a little different this week. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I'm at a conference, it's a training that has been rescheduled for 2 years for obvious reasons. So I thought I would just record for about 30 minutes some of our stuff on ethics. We just have so much to talk about in such a short amount of time. I didn't want to just take a week off. So I want to look at one subject today, and we'll get caught up by the end so y'all can give your presentations. So at the end of this, I'm going to have some discussion questions for y'all. You can talk about them until the end of class, okay? What we want to talk about today is a subject that really we can spend an entire class on it. The history of this issue around the world and even within the United States is quite shocking. So let me just say that we are barely scratching the surface here. And this is the subject I really have no good news for you outside, of course, the hope that we have in the Christian worldview. And the issue is what we call eugenics. You remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about euthanasia, right? And you remember what euthanasia meant good death, right? It was Thanos, right? This is good, genetics, genes, right? And the premise of eugenics is particularly in the modern sense, is purely Darwinian. You cannot get here in a postmodern 21st century without holding to natural selection. You're just not going to get there philosophically. And so that is the bedrock of what it is that we have here. Now think about what Darwinism really teaches. Darwinism is progressive. We start out with simple organisms. Through time and chance and mutation, we've become much more complicated. And with each passing generation, and as years turns into millennia, what you get is a better specimen. Right, so Friedrich Nietzsche would talk about the Übermensch, this ideal Superman. Is where we get that term, is it from Nietzsche, which is probably not a good thing. So we'll reach this pinnacle of utopia. This is very much a progressive Darwinist ideal. It's why they are called progressives, right? And so the question then becomes, if evolution is going to get us there, is it possible to speed that process up? And how would you speed that process up? Well, one of the things you would do is you would keep bad genes, however that's defined, from reproducing. And you would reproduce only good genes. And there's a number of ways of doing this. But the main way ultimately comes down to is that you're going to sterilize people you feel like should not have children, okay? And you can do this in a number of ways. But the way it's been done, let's just start from the 20th century into the 21st century, has been quite horrendous, okay? So let's give a few examples in the 20th and 21st century of this phenomenon. And of course, we have to start with the obvious example, and that, of course, is Nazism. German Nazism in the early or first half of the 20th century was very much rooted in this idea. Many of you all have mentioned in our class Aryanism, right? This was the German idea that there was a pure race, typically described as blonde hair and blue-eyed. Of course, Hitler had neither of those. Hitler probably had some Jewish ancestry in him. But nevertheless, the idea was that there was this perfect specimen. And so Hitler got the country to believe that they were the perfect specimen, and then, they can take over the world. By taking over the world, they can purify human race back to this pure idea. There's an interesting book. It's a bit wonky, but fascinating. It's called From Darwin to Hitler. And it shows the progression of how it is that Hitler can even happen. And it was very much rooted in racism, that there was a pure race that we should have more of, and there were impure races we should have less of. And so you have decades, really, of propaganda pushing this. And Hitler comes and turns it into public policy. So in the concentration camps and among Nazi doctors, you have some pretty awful scientific experiments being done, forced sterilization, so where women and men couldn't have children, and then not to mention just straight up murder. We know of the Jews, but there were also other examples of this, particularly people who were handicapped. If handicap is something that can be passed on genetically, well then you've got to stop it, right? And that is how you cure diseases, would be the term that they would use. Well, what Hitler did was just simply eugenics, pure and simple. A lot of forced sterilizations going on in Germany. In America, what you essentially have is, prior to Hitler, there are countless examples of this practice going on in America. In fact, I could give you quotes. We just don't have time to get into a lot of detail of it. Quotes from very influential American politicians, celebrities, scientists, academics, and others. And I'll give you a few more modern ones, where they were pushing these ideas. In fact, in many ways, Hitler was influenced by some of the radicalism of the early progressive movement in the United States. Right now the thinking makes sense if you buy into Darwinism, and that is that if you want a peaceful, pure society without suffering, then you can do it through genetics. And what happened in the United States was countless examples of forced sterilization, scientific experiments, abortions, and everything like that. And that leads to an important figure by the name of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood. This is why her story is so important. Margaret Sanger was essentially a racist. There's just no way around that. She was a racist. She partnered with the Ku Klux Klan. She encouraged African American ministers to talk their congregation into not having children. She was very big into the contraception movement. This is before you get the birth control pill, of which she was a very big proponent of that research. And the thinking was, there are people in society who should have kids, and there are people in society who shouldn't have kids. And Planned Parenthood comes out of that. And what Planned Parenthood does now is it sets itself primarily in urban areas among racial minorities. They target the poor and they encourage the handicapped to have abortions. The work of Planned Parenthood today is no different in many senses of what the work of Margaret Sanger was in the 20th century. In fact, it was not until recently that Planned Parenthood would give out their annual Margaret Sanger Award. And they were very proud of Margaret Sanger. They would brag about her, call her this great feminist leader, because she promoted what they call women's rights. But it's funny that you take away the rights of a woman to have children if you deem her unworthy to have children. But nevertheless, one noteworthy Margaret Sanger annual award winner was Hillary Clinton whenever she ran for president against Barack Obama. And I believe Barack Obama has won that, among the other leading pro-abortion politicians. I believe within the last year, the head of Planned Parenthood has come out and said, we can no longer justify or defend the actions or the worldview of Margaret Sanger. Now, that head of Planned Parenthood didn't turn around and say, we no longer do abortions. But they at least acknowledged, finally, what the historical record shows. She was a racist. Her story comes out of that she was raised with a lot of other siblings, and her mother had a difficult pregnancy with one of them. And her home life wasn't ideal, and she blamed that pregnancy on her bad upbringing. And so became very passionate about smaller families and everything like that. Well, let me give you another example of this, a more recent example, that I think will actually just offend your sensibilities. I certainly hope it does. And this comes from a letter from Ron Weddington. Now, Ron Weddington was one of the lawyers representing Roe in the famous Roe case that legalized through the oligarchy of the Supreme Court abortion on demand. Now, there's actually 2 Supreme Court cases that has gotten us where we are now, but Roe versus Wade is the main one, of course, in 1973. So this is the one of the lawyers writing to President-elect Bill Clinton in 1992. Okay, let me read it to you. I don't think you are going to get very far in reforming the country until we have a better educated, healthier, wealthier population. You see where this is going? But you can start immediately to eliminate the barely educated, unhealthy, and poor segment of our country. No, I'm not advocating some sort of mass extinction of these unfortunate people. Crime, drugs, and disease are already doing that. The problem is that their numbers are not only replaced, but increased by the birth of millions of babies to people who can't afford to have babies. There, I've said it. It's what we all know is true, but we only whisper it because as liberals who believe in individual rights, we view any program which might treat the disadvantaged differently as discriminatory and mean-spirited. And having convinced the poor that they can't get out of poverty when they have all those extra mouths to feed, you will have to provide the means to prevent the extra mouths, because abstinence doesn't work. It's time to officially recognize that people are going to have children. And what we need to do as a nation is to prevent as much disease and as many poor babies as possible. No, government is also going to have to provide vasectomies, tubal ligations, and abortions. RU486, that's a chemical abortion, and conventional abortions. Even if we make birth control as ubiquitous as sneakers and junk food, there will still be unplanned pregnancies. There have been about 30 million abortions in this country since Roe versus Wade. It's 1992. That number is, I believe, around 60 million now. Think of all the poverty, crime, and misery, and then add 30 million unwanted babies in that scenario. That's eugenics. The thinking there from Ron Weddington is that abortion, among other means, is a way that government and society can limit the poor, limit the handicapped, and limit the unwanted. Now, notice there is a worldview there. And one of those worldviews is the belief that if you are poor, you will always be poor. Your children will be poor, and their children will be poor. So within this mindset is an already class thinking that really is Middle Ages like, medieval times. That you have the rich and you have the poor. The rich are happy, the poor are miserable. Get rid of the poor and everyone's rich. It doesn't happen that way. But it is a very elitist mindset that I'm among the ones who should reproduce, although Weddington and his wife had an illegal abortion in Mexico, which is part of why they were so involved in the Roe versus Wade case. But you can see that this is evil thinking. He's asking the president-elect of the United States, Bill Clinton, who's very pro-choice, although not nearly as pro-abortion as President Obama or now President Biden, especially his vice president, Kamala Harris, is abortion is a means of suppressing the unwanted in our society. That's evil. I mean, just straight up evil. Okay. So let's talk about examples of eugenics that are going on right now. And we can put these in categories, and we've already talked about some of these categories, right? Let's start with one obvious one, and that is the handicap, right? Handicap. Now, we talked about this 2 weeks ago when we talked about vitro fertilization, genetic modifications, embryonic stem cell research, those sort of things. This gets us into cloning, chimeras, right? Should we modify genetics? Should we mix species through genetics? All that sort of. That's really what chimeras you're doing there. You're mixing the pig and the man and all that sort of stuff. But what you have here is you can modify, an embryo, or we're getting to where you can modify embryos to avoid certain things. And that gets some real dicey area that goes beyond what we can cover in this class. But what you have here is, let's say, you have a couple that's pregnant, they go to the doctor, they have an ultrasound. And the doctor says, oh no. And they do some more tests, and they say, we think your baby is going to be born with Down syndrome. What do? That doctor is trained to then say, we recommend you terminate the pregnancy to alleviate the suffering of the child. Right? My wife and I had some close friends. We lived in Louisville. They went through this very scenario. Baby was diagnosed with trisomy 13, and immediately the doctor, family, friends pushed them to terminate the pregnancy. And really, Amanda and I were among the few voices that said, no, this child is made in the image of God. Okay? And they did give birth to a child. The child died within, I believe, about 48 hours, give or take. We went to that funeral. It's one of the saddest things that I've ever been to. But I would say it's probably the most beautiful baby I've ever seen in my life. This couple struggled with infertility, and they have, I believe, 2 or 3 kids now. But this was a moment of great grief. But the solution to the problem was murder. This isn't unique. In fact, you go to Iceland right now, you will not hardly be able to find, no matter how hard you look, you will struggle to find a single person with Down syndrome. Not because of medical advances or technology, but because of abortion. Right now in the United States, this is an issue. Not just with Down syndrome. That's the example that's always given. Trisomy 13 is a form of Down syndrome. But there are plenty of other examples. In fact, let me give you another example of this regarding Down syndrome. A case of a few years ago, there's been several cases of this, where parents sued their doctor in the hospital for an unwanted birth. They went to the doctor and did the ultrasounds and all that, and the doctor never diagnosed their unborn child with Down syndrome. So when the child was born, they discovered this child has Down syndrome. They sued the hospital and their doctor because had they known they had a child with Down syndrome, they would have terminated the pregnancy. That's eugenics. The way you eliminate disease is through genetic modification, which is coming here through abortion, and we can add to that infanticide. Infanticide has been around since the very beginning of time, frankly. But you can go back to the Roman times where fathers could choose if a child should live or not. And if he decided not, say he wanted a boy and it's a girl, or say they wanted a healthy girl and it's a Down syndrome girl, whatever syndrome might be, he would take the child out to the woods, leave it to exposure or to wild animals. And Christians were very much against infanticide and abortion. Read the early Christians in the first few centuries. Find plenty of examples of this. So we mentioned a handicap. We give other examples. Hitler did this. Abortion has always been in favor of it. Another one is, let's put minorities. So in Nazi Germany, it's the Jews, right? In America, it's the African American community. I go back to Margaret Sanger. She was a genuine racist. There are pictures of her with, Ku Klux Klan members, promoting abortions and sterilization among African Americans. And to this day, as I mentioned earlier, you will find most of your Planned Parenthoods in urban areas that are predominantly black. To me, that's racism. There's furthermore, this statistics from a few years ago when I wrote my book on this issue. 60% of African American pregnancies in New York City end in abortion, which means the most dangerous place for an African American in the United States right now is inside his or her mother's womb. Now, what happened in New York City was there was a group that wanted to push back against this trend, right, of a high rate of abortions among Black Americans. So they bought ad space, had this huge banner on the side of the building that said 60% of Black pregnancies in abortion. The city was so outraged that the city government tore it down, which is a violation of the First Amendment, frankly. It was a paid space, private property, and they had bought the ad, so it's a right of free speech. They tore it down anyways because they didn't like the message because it was anti-abortion. But the statistics are what the statistics are. That abortion has targeted minority communities more than white communities. Add to that the history of eugenics, and you have a targeting of racial minorities. I mean, this is just the way it is. Let's look at a third group, and that is women. The poster child example of this right now is China. Now, China, we'll talk about this in our current events class if we haven't already, because I've had this story for a few weeks. China extended the size of families to 3 children. Thank you very much. But for decades, it was a one-child-only policy. And in China, where inheritance is very important, if you have a daughter, you're going to abort that daughter because you have to have a son for the purpose of inheritance. And this is part of the reason why if you see an adopted Chinese child here in America, it's probably going to be female. So what you have is a dramatic increase of males and a decrease of females for generations. This is going to create a lot of problems. Not to mention the aging issue. This is a problem that Japan's having, the West is having, Europe and the United States. Just look at Frankfurt's demographics. Next time there's debates over pension. We're aging, and we're not replacing with enough children because our age bracket's dropping. We talked about that a few weeks ago. But women are often the targets. A few years ago, there was a bill. This may have just been at a state level. I'm pretty sure it's state level. There's several of these. And the bill was, it should be illegal to abort a child based off of race and gender. Okay? So basically, if a woman comes in and says, look, I believe this child will be mixed race. Okay? Therefore, I want that child to be aborted. Or if you come in and say, look, my boyfriend and I, we don't want to have a girl. We only want to have a boy. We discover we're having a girl. We're going to abort the baby. Okay. So the laws would have prevented all of that. They were rejected by the progressive left because their philosophy is abortion good. Okay? And so they will not support any policy whatsoever that limits abortions. And so it was brought out like, how can you be a feminist if you will not stop something that is literally killing women and targeting women for death, right? Well, this is, in America, we're primarily doing it through abortion. Historically, we did it in other ways. We've cut out a lot of other stuff. But women are often the target of eugenics. We see that in Europe as well. Fourthly, and finally, we have here the poor. We have the poor. And this is what you saw in that Ron Weddington quote, isn't it? He mentions these, but he's really saying, look, there's going to be poor people. Why don't we just get rid of them and we get rid of poverty? Well, that's evil, right? But that's eugenics. This is what eugenics does. So you go back to the history of America. Again, you have forced sterilization of criminals. So if you're in prison, you want to get years taken off your sentence, you could be sterilized so that you can't reproduce. The same thing was done with some of the poor. We don't want your kind around here. You procreated too large of a rate and the government can't take care of that and all that sort of stuff. It is often targeting poor people. Okay? And if you want to present your ethical thing at the end of the week or end of the class, this issue, like doing a historical study of this just within the United States, I think would shock you. It really would shock you. And we're just barely scratching the surface. So I want to, in about 5 minutes or so, and when a preacher says 5 minutes, he really means about 15. I How do we respond to this? How do we think as Christians with the issue of eugenics? We obviously reject this, right? But how do we think about some of these things? Well, let's look at some of these groups here. Let's start with the handicap. How does a Christian think about handicaps? Well, we go back to the creation, decreation, recreation, new creation, right? Creation is that everyone's made in the image of God, regardless of status, regardless of their economic status, their ethnicity, race, or their medical needs, right? Everyone's made in the image of God, therefore everyone is equal before the eyes of God, worthy of creation and redemption. And so our approach to this is we believe that all life is a gift of God, including those with handicaps. Look, one of the things I like to point out is every Down syndrome person you've ever met, a baby, a child, an adult, whatever, you walked away feeling better. Pure and simple. Pure and simple. And there's a reason for that. You know? For one, their extra chromosome affects their personality and whatnot. But there's a sympathy we have, but then we receive from someone who is different from us a joy that we wish we had. We would furthermore say that beauty is not to be confused with prettiness. Okay? So the Christian worldview would look at the face of a Down syndrome child and say, that child is more beautiful than the airbrush photo of some model in a magazine. Because we don't confuse prettiness with beauty. By the way, this is a good pastoral point about our self-body image. But we can't chase that rabbit. Read Song of Solomon 1 actually is a good example of that. Anyway, so we would say God's glory is seen in the Down syndrome child more than it is in the edited photo you'll find online, right? So we definitely, we don't think you should ever murder people, regardless of the context of their conception or their medical needs. We would say undesirables. This would be, when we get handicap, we could add to handicap the undesirables. But this can also be a racial undesirable, right? This could be a gender undesirable, could be a socioeconomic undesirable. You'll find this term undesirable all the time in the study of eugenics. What do we think about this term? Well, in the Bible, God uses people who are considered the undesirables, right? So the story of Jephthah. Remember, Jephthah was one of the judges that liberates Israel in the book of Judges. He was the son of a harlot, an unwanted baby, an unplanned pregnancy. Jesus himself was an unplanned pregnancy, literally, because Mary was a virgin, right? And so we have no category of the undesirables. God can and often does use the most unlikely people. Cyrus is seen as a liberating king among the prophets from Isaiah. Paul is a murderer of Christians who becomes the most recognized apostle of the Christians. Example after example we could give of God showing grace and using the undesirables. What about the poor? Our view of wealth here is important. The assumption is that if you're wealthy, you're happy and good. If you're poor, you're unhappy and bad. Right? That sort of religious thinking, and very black and white, the way religion thinks, is unbiblical. The Bible is very clear. You can be rich, miserable, and unrighteous. You can be rich and righteous and happy, right? You can be poor and righteous and happy. You can be poor and unrighteous on that, right? You know, it's more complicated than that. So we have wealthy people in the Bible who are very evil. Some of them in positions of power, like Jezebel or Herod or some others. There are wealthy people who are in positions of power who are righteous. I'm preaching through the story of David, largely a righteous man. His home life isn't ideal, but viewed as one who sought after God's own heart. Abraham and some others, Joseph of Arimathea, Priscilla and Aquila in the New Testament. Plenty of examples of people who are wealthy and yet righteous. Plenty of examples of people who are wealthy and unrighteous. Plenty of examples of people who are poor and righteous. How about Jesus? Ever heard of him? Plenty of examples of people who are poor and unrighteous in the Bible. Right? So we don't think you should target an entire class of people for death. Right? I don't know why that's rocket science, but apparently it is cutting edge. And also it assumes that there isn't, in a free market society, which we're getting less and less with each administration, in a free market society, history has shown plenty of people come out of poverty. But society has to promote that. When society promotes victimhood, that cuts down quite a bit. I grew up in a rural community where this sort of thinking is very prevalent. Anyways, that's I don't want to chase that rabbit. Let's end with a passage I referenced 2 weeks ago, and I'll probably reference 1,000 times. John chapter 9. You remember the story? Jesus and his disciples are walking, and they see a man blind from birth. And they say, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? And the assumption is his handicap is the result of unrighteousness. Right? That's religious thinking. By the way, it's rooted in, it's what eugenics is rooted in. You're poor because you're a bad person, or something bad happened, or society has victimized you, or whatever it is, right? Remember what Jesus says? No. God allowed him to be poor, or to be, he is poor because of his handicap, but to be handicapped, blind, so that on this day you may see the glory of God. And through that man's testimony, Jesus launches into his I am the light of the world. Because in that story, we have a contrast between light and darkness. The blind man sees, and the seeing men are blind. Go read that story. It's my favorite story of the Gospels, because the guy's a smart aleck. That's really why I like it. But it's a fascinating story, well written, well told. And the climax is that Jesus, as the one who opens eyes, is therefore the light of the world. That is our view when it comes to eugenics. And it's why when we look at creation and fall, all these categories, poor, the handicapped, undesirable, as a result of the fall, we live in a broken world. But the story of redemption is we're made in the image of God, and Christ offers redemption to all, regardless of status, how society may view them, or anything else. And the day will come when at the resurrection there will be no more brokenness, and this will be but a faint memory. All right, guys, so I've left some notes and stuff for you guys to discuss, and hope you guys have a great rest of class. Again, sorry I can't be there, but Lord willing, I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.